So ladies and gentlemen, can everybody hear me? Thank you all for being here. I'm Crosby, Kemper, the director of the Kansas City Public Library, here tonight with Cris Medina, the CEO of Guadalupe Center on their 100th anniversary. I want to mention a couple of upcoming programs at the library before we jump into what we're doing tonight. I do want to mention that tomorrow night at the Plaza Library, we have Ben Lerner. If you read the New York Times, you would have read a long and highly admiring article about Ben Lerner today in the New York Times in the arts section. He's one of our finest young novelists. He's just published his third novel, the title of which I believe is Topeka, and it is really about Topeka. And Ben grew up in Lawrence, Kansas, and is very highly thought of, and he'll be at the Plaza Library tomorrow night. And then one of my personal favorites over the years, this will be the 5th time we've had him in the library, on Monday, October 14th, also at the Plaza Library, we have David Thompson, who I believe is the world's greatest living film critic, has come to us from San Francisco. He'll be talking about, the title of his talk is Screening Desire. He'll be talking, but we'll also be having a conversation. And it's basically, he's just published his latest book, which is called Sleeping with Strangers, How the Movies Shape Desire. So we'll be talking about sex and desire in the public library. Please keep your children at home. But David is very witty, and that will be a lot of fun. So we have a lot of other things coming up. Please get our calendar. But tonight, I'm excited to be talking to Cris about the 100th anniversary of the Guadalupe Center. And Cris, am I right? I read somewhere in Guadalupe's presentations that you are that this is the longest continuously serving Hispanic center in the United States. Is that right?
That's correct. We are the longest continuously operating Latino organization in the United States. When we had our building renovated in 2003, the landmark building, we had to do some research because the building qualified to be on the National Historic Register. As a result, we hired an historian, and she checked. There was 2 other groups that one was older but no longer existed, and then another one still was around, but they changed their mission, and so we were the oldest, and so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Number 1. Okay. And you know, and you and I talked a little bit about this. There of course there is this view, and I think it's a view even in the Hispanic community and the Latino community in Kansas City that and Guadalupe of course started in 1919 and continuously existing since then. But actually, the Hispanic influence in Kansas City goes back to the very founding of Kansas City. And I like to tell, this is one of my favorite things to do, to tell any audience interested in local history, but particularly an audience that might have Hispanic members in it. The founder of Kansas City, we think sometimes, we talk about the Chouteaus, we talk about McCoys and the other people in Westport, usually on St. Patrick's Day. The Irish and the Scottish get together, drink a lot of whiskey, and talk about the Celtic founding of Kansas City. The French like to claim it, but the true founder of Kansas City was Manuel Lisa. He was a partner of the Chouteaus, but he actually had the first encampment at the confluence of the Kaw and the Missouri rivers. And Manuel Lisa was the son of 2 Spanish immigrants to New Orleans. He was born in New Orleans, but of 2 Spanish parents. And you will know that there's something called the Missouri Fur Company that was the Chouteaus company, and that was the great fur company of the West, and helped settle and build St. Louis and Kansas City. But actually, the company that was refounded after he had his dispute with the Chouteaus, the Manuel Lisa Fur Company, is the first encampment in our region. And so Kansas City was actually a Hispanic founding. If you leave with nothing else tonight, you have that little factoid. So, but But of course, Chris, the reason for the founding of the Guadalupe Center is the great growth of the Hispanic population, essentially the Mexican population, the Mexican immigrant population in the teens. The Mexican Revolution was going on. Father Munoz came. Tell us about that.
Sure. Well, the Mexican Revolution started around 1910, and it ran about 10 years, up to 1920. There was a lot of bloodshed, a lot of unrest, a lot of poverty. Families were looking for better alternatives. If there was opportunities to get out of the country, and especially if you were poor, which the majority of the country was, they were looking for alternatives where they could raise families in a stable situation and prosper. With the end of World War I, the migration of Europeans to this country stopped, and also the Asian population. And those were the two main workforce that the railroads used to build the railroads, especially in the Midwest. As a result, the railroads, the Atchison, the Topeka, and the Santa Fe, looked to Mexico to bring laborers. And they looked to northern Mexico into Texas. In fact, that's how my great-grandmother came here in 1919 with 11 children. She was a widow. But they migrated here. Now, it's true of so many of the families that came up here. If you follow the migration of the train, say from Fort Worth all the way to Chicago and all those rail centers, you're going to find Mexican neighborhoods in all of those cities. And there was laborers, the camps, and wherever the rail centers are, you're going to find the Mexican neighborhoods. In Kansas City, it was West Bottoms, West Side, Sheffield. Kansas, it was Rosedale, Armadale, and Argentine.
Yeah, absolutely. And the meat packing plants also came with the railroads, because the railroads were initially basically replaced the trails, like the Chisholm Trail, that were cattle trails. The cattle drives came up to this part of the country, to Kansas and to Kansas City in particular, and so the railroads replaced them. And brought the cattle business to Kansas City, and therefore also the meat packing business. So the railroads and meat packing was what employed. And also there's part of our heritage which is not as well known as it should be, and I'm rewriting Kansas City history right here for you. There was a railroad started by a man named Arthur Stillwell called the Kansas City, Mexico, and Orient Railway. Because as is pointed out in some of the material of Guadalupe Center, the Mexican coast is actually closer to Kansas City than the California coast. And so if you want to go to the Pacific, it's actually shorter to go to Mexico, the Mexican coast, than to California. So there was a railway called the Kansas City, Mexico, and Orient Railway, as well as the Kansas City Southerners. Both were founded by Arthur Stillwell and employed Mexicans who were coming up the trails and the rails. So there grew to be this large Hispanic community, and there was Father Munoz,
right,
who was actually Spanish, I believe, originally.
Well, no, actually he was Mexican. He came up here in 1914, and at that time there was also a lot of persecution of the Catholic priests. They were killing many and hanging them. He left because he was going to be killed, and he was a refugee just like many of the other immigrants that came up here. He followed a lot of the immigrants that came here, migrated here, and he eventually settled on the west side. He bought a property at 23rd and Holly, where he first established a church for the immigrant arrivals who had come and settled on the west side. And that was the first community for Our Lady of Guadalupe Parish.
Right. Okay. And it was the first church in Kansas City that was a Spanish-speaking church, in which the services were in Spanish, even though there was already a fairly significant Mexican and Mexican-American community at that point. So it was the first time. And And so this church became a center for the Latino community.
As the population grew, first initially when these workers were coming up, they were coming by themselves, and they would stay, say, 9-10 months out of the year, and they would go back when it was extremely cold and they couldn't work. Over time, they needed the laborers all year, and as a result, they started to bring their families. Housing was very difficult. People, many of these families lived in boxcars. They used to warm their houses with coal. I love the stories of a lot of our seniors who come to the center to this day, and they tell me of their childhood, and they remember a lot of those situations, those days that when they were children growing up, how they can remember those things. Kansas City, it was hard for these people. It was a new land. They didn't know the customs. They didn't know the culture. Didn't know the language. And there was a lot of discrimination. These people couldn't find housing. It was tough for a lot of them. Initially, that's why they were living in boxcars. Eventually, the railroads tried to assist with more housing because they needed the laborers. And they started to move into the housing little by little. I know one of the first stories that we read on the diaries of the center was in the early 1916, 17, the community was very excited because 18 of the families that had moved here were able to buy housing. Most of them had rental properties.
Yeah.
But that was kind of the start for them to.
But the sort of social service pressure on Father Munoz and on Our Lady of Guadalupe must have been substantial. I read that he had to do 300 baptisms a year. That being the only priest available, and so there was a huge social service gap, which sort of predicts what the Guadalupe Center became. But the origins of some of the social services was with to some extent with Dorothy Gallagher. Dorothy Gallagher, the Amberg Club. Explain who she was and what that was.
At the time, many of these immigrants, the majority were of Catholic descent. The Catholic diocese, there was a number of people. The West Side had a large Catholic population, a lot of German, Irish. In fact, there was our Sacred Heart Parish, which still exists today, existed there, and then you had Cathedral, which is very close to this building. And the bishop at the time was Bishop Lillis. They saw that there was a tremendous need with these immigrants. They had all types of issues: housing, health. They needed some health screenings. They needed also food. They needed translation services. There was just a vast array of services that they were needing. As a result, he was able to talk to a group of young women. Most of these, in fact, was kind of unique at the time. They were professional Anglo women. Most of them were teachers or young professionals that had formed this Agnes Ward Amber Club. And this club was actually formed as a model out of Chicago. This group of volunteers came together, and I think the first services they came to do at what later became the Guadalupe Center was a summer school for kids in the neighborhood, and they had about 18 volunteers, and that started in 1918. The following year, they started the Guadalupe Center in 1919. It was in September when they opened, and then they provided a prenatal clinic for the children and other health screenings. And they also did adult education, and English classes was huge. They were trying to help these people to assimilate. So that was the beginnings of the center. With time, the bishop, through the help of Dr. Thomas Purcell, who was a dentist and a very prominent Irish, layperson involved in the Catholic Church, he was able to persuade the bishop at the time to buy a Swedish Lutheran church that had been vacated in the west side of 23rd Madison, which later became Our Lady of Guadalupe. So I think they bought it for $5,000, and they were able to then move the parish from 23rd Holly from a house into that location.
Right.
And the first center was actually opened, what is now the rectory, which was a house adjacent to the church. And that's where the center first
Right,
started.
and then the current building came in the 30s?
That's correct.
The current original Guadalupe Center?
Right.
By itself building. And how did that come about?
Yeah. Well, Dorothy Gallagher first got involved with the center in 1921. Dorothy Gallagher was a prominent socialite. Her father had a drugstore here at 9th and Penn. Eventually, it grew and ended up at, I think, 8th and Broadway. But he was very wealthy. They had a nice house. She went to college, Trinity College, I believe, in Washington, D.C., because there was no Catholic college that would take women here in Kansas City at the time. And then she ended up going to St. Louis University, Washington University, to get her degree in social work. She ended up working for Notre Dame de Sion as a French teacher in 1921. And her first involvement with the center was the diocese with the Amber Club was doing a Christmas drive. And they got most of these women in these different groups within the church to help raise Christmas baskets. Dorothy got involved. She coordinated it through the school, Notre Dame de Sion, and she came and helped pass out the baskets. She saw the need. She had studied to be a social worker. She had talked about going abroad to do that. And after coming to work in the community and seeing the needs of the community, of the Latinos, Mexican people, she goes, I don't have to go out to Europe. I can do my work here. And that was the first involvement with her in the West Side in the Guadalupe Center.
I mean, and it's interesting to note that the actual Hispanic community and the jobs in particular were on the Kansas City, Kansas side, in Armourdale and Rosedale and Argentine, et cetera. And yet Guadalupe Center is a little bit further to the east. And but eventually the community grew up around the center too.
No question. A lot of that had to do with, came later years, in fact, in the flood of 51. Large parts of Armadale and Argentine, a lot of those Mexican families lost everything. And a large segment of that Mexican population moved to the west side as a result. Right. They moved into what was then called the Sacred Heart Parish, and that's where a lot of those Mexican families came over.
Right. So, and the relationship of the center to the Catholic Church, to the diocese, the bishops, et cetera, was very strong at the beginning. I would assume.
No question.
And how did that come about? And then what happened to separate?
Okay. Well, no question that the diocese was, without their intervention, there would be no Guadalupe Center. They not led the groundwork for their endeavors to reach out to our population and to provide them with services. They also were, of course, apostolizing them and reaching out to them and providing religious services. But at the same time, they were also providing social services, which was huge. Their mission was to help the community assimilate, because they did this not just in the Mexican community. There was also 3 other settlement houses that they opened in Kansas City. There was one for the Polish, the St. Stanislaus, and then they had one for the Irish, the St. Patrick's. Then you had Holy Rosary for the Italians. So ours settlement house was the Guadalupe Center. The biggest difference between those settlement houses, we're the only one that still has our immigrants coming. Those other ones don't to this day, but we do. But as a result, the diocese was very engaged, very involved through their lay programs. The Amber Club was huge. When Dorothy Gallagher became headmaster and director, that was in 1924, and she stayed until it was 1926, and she stayed until 1944. She was there 18 years as the headmaster director. She took no pay. She worked, without a salary. She raised money to build what is now our historic facility. That was built in 1936. She paid for the architectural drawings. They did that in 1934. And she purposely had the building made with the Hispanic design to tie into the culture and to the community. Right. And that was huge, because then she was sending a message to the residents that, that you're important. We appreciate your culture. It's,
Right.
you can come here and assimilate, but you don't have to lose your culture. And I think that's one of the things that made her a great woman.
I never really thought about this, but we were talking about that specifically. At the same time, J.C. Nichols is building the plaza with a Spanish theme. It's called the Plaza, after all. And was there any sense in the Hispanic community and the Latino community that they had a relationship to that, or was that just seen as a Disneyland being created a little further south?
Well, they really couldn't afford to shop there, but it was ironic. When they first opened it, they came to the center to get performers and to have the people from the center make food for them. And we've got pictures from the fiestas that they used to do on the Country Club Plaza,
Right.
where you have participants from the center that
Right.
were actually part of that celebration.
Yeah, there it is. There's the wonderful picture. I think this is in President Trump's office right now. Thank you.
Good point.
But this is actually 1938, is
Correct.
that right?
That's correct.
The Grupo
That's correct.
Artístico,
Yeah.
who performed in an ethnic festival in
Yes.
D.C. and
Right.
actually won the award, right?
Exactly. One of the things that Dorothy Gallagher did was help have the people retain their culture and take pride in it. And she saw that meant a lot to the residents and the community. As a result, they formed this dance group, not just dancers, but musicians as well. It was Grupo Artístico. They performed, and they would perform for the fiestas there. They did those at fundraisers, and they were, I've got pictures of the first fiesta they did in front of Our Lady of Guadalupe Shrine, 1922. And had over 5,000 people, and you've got people from all over the city there. It's really great. She took this group to participate in a national ethnic festival in Washington, D.C. in 1938. For her to do that at that time was huge. I mean, you can imagine the cost. For us to send a group right now to D.C. or something, that would cost us a lot of money, and it's pretty expensive. How she did that, I don't know, but they win, and they won the competition, which was fantastic. What made it even nicer was that Eleanor Roosevelt presented them with the award.
Right.
And she promised them, she asked them, where are you guys from? And of course, they told her Kansas City. And she promised them if she ever came to Kansas City, she would come and visit them. Well, she came 2 years later to Kansas City. And she comes, and the mayor at the time is John Gage, and he's excited that she's coming, the First Lady, and she tells him, where's the Guadalupe Center? And he's kind of flabbergasted.
He didn't know, right?
So it's over on the west side. He said, well, I want to go there. And so as a result, she went down there, and the place was packed with kids, and people were so excited for her to be there. She turns to the mayor and says, where do all these kids play at? And the kids respond, well, they point up to the hill, and there was a dump across the street, which is now a park. And Mr. Roosevelt turned to the mayor and said, we can do better than that, can't we, Mr. Mayor? As a result, they turned that dump into a park, and it's called Gage Park, named John after the mayor at the time, but it should have been named Dorothy Gallagher Park.
Yeah. Maybe we should start a movement to name it after Dorothy Gallagher.
Yeah.
Well, so, the 30s, the center is built, the new center is built, and you're getting some traction there. There's also a slowdown, I think, in immigration around
Right.
that time. It's in the 20s we get very restrictive legislation, though none of it actually prevents people coming from Mexico, interestingly enough, the legislation in the 20s. But there's a general slowdown. Kansas City at that point in the 30s, the Commercial Club, the predecessor of the Chamber of Commerce, calls Kansas City the most American city, by which they mean the fewest immigrants and people who don't look like the members of the Chamber of Commerce. And so the racial problems, racial antagonism, a major problem in Kansas City at that point and for the Hispanic community?
Sure. You had the Depression. A lot of families went back to Mexico. In fact, my grandmother, they moved back, and all her family was still here. It was like in 1932, and a lot of them didn't come back. They went back to Mexico, and they stayed because there was no work. They were the first to be let go. It was a very difficult time. My family came back only because my grandmother got so homesick. All her family was here, and she got very sick, and my grandfather said, okay, I'm taking you back. They came back, and they struggled, but they stayed this again, and we're here to this day as a result of that. But it was hard for those families because, there was still a lot of, racism and a lot of hate. And those jobs at that time, as you knew, they were hard. There was not too many.
Right. And I know this, I've talked briefly about this, but I know this about the African-American community nationally and to some extent in Kansas City. Both World War I, but particularly World War II, changed things, took a long time, but changed things for people of color because they fought. They joined the armed forces and were part of the liberation of Europe. I think from our conversation, it was important in the Hispanic community. There were a lot of people who joined the armed forces who fought in World War II.
No question. I mean, you could go every block on the neighborhood, and you had flags displayed in the windows for their sons who had gone to either one of the branches of the service to fight in World War II. We had some that didn't come back. The majority did, thank God. And they were very, when they were called upon to do their duty, there was no second thought. They were there. You didn't have people leave. I'm going to leave the country because I don't want to go fight. That didn't happen. They said, hey, this is our country. We're going to do our duty. And they did. We have a great picture, I don't think we have it here today, of the veterans that came back from the war, World War II, and it's in front of the church. And that picture was taken because early in the 1949 or 1950, the president of Mexico came to visit Kansas City, President Aleman, and as a result, he wanted to see the Mexican colony, as they called it. And he came to the west side, and they were there to visit.
It's interesting also in the material that Guadalupe has about this history. There was a Mexican consul in Kansas City very early on because of the large Mexican and Mexican-American population. And talk for a second, I mean, I know there are big changes in the geography of the Latino community in Kansas City over time. And you mentioned before, one of the biggest is the 1951 flood, which really moved a lot of people into the west side out of the bottoms on both sides of the river, out of Armourdale and Argentine. But there's also, you're a sixth generation?
Yes.
Is that right?
Correct.
There's also a sort of generational thing in immigration to Kansas City. There are people like you whose families have been here for 6 generations, and there are people who've been here for 6 days or 6 months or 6 years or whatever. And is that ever an issue in the Latino community?
I guess the biggest difference now is that, our population, our immigration still comes. It's we have families that have been here for, like I say, 5, 6 generations, easy. And a lot of those families, though, no longer reside in the neighborhood in the west side. They're all over. You can find Latinos in every part of the city. And that's fine. You still might have a few families that you can trace back all the way back to the early 1900s that still have some roots there. And that's good. But we still have that constant immigration coming. A lot of it is not just people from outside the country. We're seeing a lot of Latinos come from California, Arizona.
Central America.
Central America.
Huge,
yeah. We're seeing a lot of people come from New York, from Ohio. Those tend to be Dominicans, Puerto Ricans. They're coming to Kansas City for jobs. The immigrants that are coming from California and Arizona and the far west, they're coming because it's jobs. Most of them tend to be Mexican Americans or Mexican immigrants, but they're born here and they're moving over here because it's affordable. There's jobs, and the cost of living here is very affordable to what they pay for in housing in those other states, especially in California.
Right, right. And so it also, and you mentioned this, but changing the geography and the centers of living in town, and we noticed this in the library. Our largest immigrant community, and it's a lot of different immigrant communities, but it's still substantially Latino, is in Northeast. our Northeast Library. In fact, this is just a little advertisement for the library for a second. We're just about to spend $4 million on our Northeast Library, the largest renovation we've done since I've been here. And it's partly we've created, and now we're going to house our Refugee and Immigrant Services organization in the Northeast Library, because there's so many different immigrant groups, but again, still substantially Hispanic. And so you've seen that happen. You've probably seen that happen in your period of time at Guadalupe.
No question. I mean, if you look why, our center when it started was on the west side. We now have facilities. In fact, the bulk of our facilities are now on the east side. We have a campus that we...
Talk about the campus.
Okay.
That's very impressive.
We bought the old St. Paul School of Theology campus. It had 9 buildings, 19 acres. We use 7 of those buildings currently. We've got 2 that we're going to renovate. Still, we have 1 that's going under renovation now, a library that's going to be a library for the schools. In the daytime, our elementary school and our pre-K program are housed there. We will have adult education programs there in the evening. And then we have 1 other building that will become a teacher housing unit. We have trouble recruiting bilingual teachers. Right now, we have the 2nd largest charter school in Kansas City, Missouri. We have 1,500 students. We have close to 600 over at the campus in the elementary school. The old De La Salle School, the original De La Salle School, which is at 15th and Paseo, which is in the 18th and Vine District, is our high school. We're maxed out there. We've got 430 students housed there. Have another 330 kids over on the west side at our middle school. Our challenge is space. We need more space. We've got another 500 kids wanting to come to our schools. We have no room for them. 97% of the kids that we serve at our schools are Latinos.
And I would assume, but tell me, do they come from all over the community? Because there's a fairly big Hispanic community in Olathe, obviously out towards Independence, along Independence Avenue, big Hispanic community. Are they coming from all over town?
You have to, in order to attend a charter school in Kansas City, Missouri, you have to live within the district. So our students come from the Kansas City, Missouri School District, which is basically from the river to 85th Street, from 435 on the east to the state line on the west. Within those boundaries, you have to reside. And the majority of our kids, quite frankly, I can tell you the zip codes, which are 64123, 24, 27, 25, 64108, 64111, which is west side, Westport, a little bit of Midtown, and 7 neighborhoods in Northeast and about 3 neighborhoods in the east side.
Right.
So that's the bulk. Yes,
Likens neighborhood, for
Sheffield,
instance, is now Sheffield,
Blue Valley,
primarily, Hispanic.
Yeah.
So that's so interesting. There's one thing I do want to go back to that we started to talk about that we didn't really finish, which is the relationship to the church, because it was very strong, very strong core, and yet there's a separation that right. happened, which may have been very natural or not.
Yeah, and it was not. It was very. It was a difficult separation. One that really split the community. It happened in 1974. I remember I was in high school when that happened. It was one where the board at the time, when Dorothy Gallagher left in 1944, the diocese ran the center from 44 up until 2000, 2000, I believe 4. There was a board of directors that was appointed, but at the end of the day, the bishop had the final say. So you had a board that overseen the operations, but you still had the bishop who had the power to say yes or no. The controversy arose when the board hired a director, an executive director to operate the center that the bishop did not approve of. And they questioned him and said, well, why don't you want him? And he said, I don't have to give you a reason. He's not going to be the guy. And so find somebody else. It became ugly. They ended up going to court. Before it got to that point, the bishop said, either you remove him or you guys are going to have to leave. And that's what eventually happened. So the center, the organization, had to leave the facility, its original facility that was built in 1936. They moved to the south end of the neighborhood, to 2640 Bellevue, which is now our youth center. And they went to court to fight over the funding for United Way. Had the center not won that court battle, I think it would have been very hard for the center to continue, because they were able to win, and as a result, they kept the funding. Without that funding, it would have been almost impossible for them to continue.
And so what's the relationship to the church today? Distant friends or?
It's funny. We'll work with them sometimes. We have a scholarship program where we work. For example, we have a scholarship that's named after Tony Agera, who was one of our great leaders, worked at the center for 50 years and working with youth. That one is for high school students. So there, if you want to go to a private school, and most of our kids will go to Catholic schools, we'll put a $1,500. Bill Dunn Sr. will match that, and then the high school will match it. And so then we're giving a scholarship of $4,500 to a Catholic school.
Right.
How many two groups do that? On the other hand, when we talk to the diocese about, why don't you sell us one of your closed school buildings? And they don't want to cooperate. So they told us, well, you're taking our kids. I said, well, what kids? You closed all your schools. You only got 2 schools left. They have one in Westport and one over in Northeast.
Right.
We most recently tried to buy Our Lady of Guadalupe Catholic School here at 23rd and Madison. We had our architect go through there. The building needs over $500,000 worth of renovations, and the diocese wanted, over $1 million for the properties. There's no way.
Right.
So, it's not.
It's not really close, I guess we'd say. There are a lot of things that are historically that change over time, but there are a lot of things that have stayed the same in what Guadalupe does. And we've got Tony Agera's picture up here, the sports teams. And sports, and Tony Agera is a great example. You could tell us what fish means, because that's pretty interesting. But this history of sports in the community is very strong. It's one of the things that Guadalupe has been known for, and Tony Agera in particular.
Well, Tony, he was a gifted athlete in himself. Tony, in fact, played for Redemptorist High School. Played basketball, was all city, and played. The St. Louis Cardinals tried to sign him for baseball, but his father wouldn't sign him to go play. He didn't want him to do that. As a result, he never had the opportunity to go play professional baseball. But Tony then played for the center. The center has sponsored a lot of teams. In fact, part of the assimilation process for the center was to offer sports teams. And we got pictures of teams from the early 1924 and on. And as a result, Tony, after his playing days, started to coach the kids. I played for Tony. I mean, that's how far back Tony went. Tony worked for us for over 50 years, and I remember when he died, they had the funeral reception at Redemptorist Church. He had a line that went wrapped around that building. It was powerful. I mean, he was so well loved by the people in the community. It was tremendous. FISH was his acronym. It was friendship, intelligence, sportsmanship, and honesty. And that's what he preached to the kids. And he was a great role model.
And it continues today at Guadalupe that athletics is very important and in the community. And then obviously there's the Agera Center on the west side, which is across the street essentially from our Ruiz Library, our West Side Library, where we work very closely with the center. And the other things that you continue to do, and again, this is a good slide to work from. You've always been about families. You've always been about helping people get jobs. You've been about language training, and about education. I mean, you've got a list of things that you've always done, and I guess the waves of immigration and the needs of the community are in some ways permanent. There's a permanent need for what you do.
Yeah, our core mission was to provide basic services. So education's huge. Now we do adult education. We do a lot of workforce development. Our high school, the theme for the high school is college or career, and we put just as much emphasis on career for kids that don't want to go to college as those that do. So that's huge. In terms of our social services, Many times families come to us in very difficult situations where they maybe don't have housing, they're looking for jobs, they might, need food. We provide those basic services first. And then we figure out what can we do to alleviate the situation. We need to work with these families so we can eventually have them provide for themselves.
Well, in families, the question about families have always been integral, obviously, to what you've done from the teens on. What are the demographics today? Is the Hispanic community in Kansas City, is it suffering in the same ways that many parts of the rest of the community, where there are lots of seniors living alone, families, broken families, et cetera? Is that also a part of what you do today?
Well, the Latino population in Kansas City, the metropolitan area, about 7 counties. We're about 10% of the population. It's a little bit over 200,000. And if you look at, it's about 55% live on the Kansas side, 45% on the Missouri side.
And you're the fastest growing demographic
Right.
in Kansas City, fastest growing in the library district and in the Kansas City school district for sure.
Right.
But I think metro-wide.
In Kansas City, Missouri school district, we're 30% of the enrollment. And we look at the age demographics for Latinos, I think in Kansas City, it's about 26. We're the youngest by far. And that's the future workforce for, this city. So that's huge, and it's only going to continue to grow.
And let's talk about that in political terms, which ultimately has got to be important to Guadalupe for funding and for your presence in the community. There was, of course, in the 60s, there was a beginning of an activist movement in the community, in the Latino community, as well as in lots of other parts of the community. And does that still have an effect? The political, there's been concern. Certainly, the Star and the media have written about some concerns in the Latino community that they're underrepresented politically. For the size of the community.
And I would concur with that. There's no question. In the 60s, you had a lot of civil disorder. I remember the riots that were here in the 60s. In fact, that's when the center was separating from the diocese. You're questioning a lot of the establishment. And people were tired of being oppressed and being tired of being told what to do. They wanted to be able to make their own decisions. And that's when you had Chicano activism and people became active, and that was good. That was a good thing, okay? We somehow got off of that, and what you had for a long time was a lot of voter apathy. They don't care, we're not going, nothing's going to change, and people were not engaged that they need to do. What we try to do now, one of the things we've done with our national partner, which is Unidos US, which was the former La Raza. Right. Voter registration is huge, and we have really, the last, I want to say decade, have really pushed hard to make a difference on issues. And how we're going to do that, let's get our people to vote. Why do they need to vote? And how, and get them on boards and commissions and to help find good candidates. They don't always have to be Latinos, but we want them to vote for our issues and be aware of them. So right. We look for candidates that can support us.
It's interesting you talk about in the 60s there was a push for activism and then a growth of apathy. But I think I'm correct in saying, I think she still is. Isn't Janet Murguia the head of US La Raza, who's from Kansas City? She's a Kansas City. A lot of people know the Murguia family, and so it's interesting that Unidos US is actually run by Janet.
Well, and there's it's not an accident that we've held their national convention here twice. Last time was in 2016, which was also a controversial time. That convention should have been here or sooner. It would have been here in 14 or 13, but that's when we had Mayor Funkhauser appointing Francis Semler, who was a member of the Minutemen, to the board of the Parks Board. And our community rallied together and said, hey, this is not acceptable.
It didn't last long.
No. And and as a result, that convention was put on hold, and they didn't come until that was done.
Yeah. Very, very good. Another thing that has been important from the beginning of Guadalupe and important in the community and has become increasingly important to the rest of us are the fiestas, the social activities, the larger social activities, and you've made they've become I think citywide celebrations now, where they used to be the Latino community celebrations. Is that important to Guadalupe? Is that important to the community?
Sure. We it's important that we retain our culture and our history, and it's important that we share it with others as well. And so we're no different. We want to be Irish on St. Patrick's Day, and we want everybody to be Mexican on Cinco de Mayo. Okay.
Amen. Amen. And so let's talk a little bit about we've talked about the present and this geographical dispersion of the community, but at the same time you've built things like the Villa Guadalupe that on the St. Paul's campus that has attracted people. And what are the issues going forward that are really important to Guadalupe and to the community?
Our center continues to evolve. We have a credit union now that we have a financial institution which we've set up to help our clients grow. We've got over 1,600 members. We're banking the people that are hard to bank, that had no credit or had bad credit and want to reestablish credit. But if we're going to help our families to grow and develop, we needed to have financial resources, and that's one way we could do it. Another thing we're going to be doing is now we're getting into the housing. We need to have affordable housing, especially West Side's a perfect example. We've got gentrification going on there.
Right.
We don't have a problem with new people coming in, but when they start to displace the ones that have been there, then we got a real problem.
Well,
with that.
and you're building. I mean, we've just gone through assessment, and everybody in this room knows we have a problem with that. And part of the problem is West Side's a really good example. You have people moving in with $1 million houses and whatnot on the West Side, and the people who are in places that they've lived for generations, all of a sudden their property taxes go way up because of something somebody else did. And there's a craziness to that
No
I
question.
think particularly affects the West Side community.
So how do we deal with that issue, and how do we help those people that want to stay there? Because if they raise those taxes to the levels they're talking, within 2 or 3 years, they're not going to be able to afford their taxes, and they're going to be forced out. All of a sudden, our property is very attractive to other people and developers.
So, I mean, you're talking about two issues that are not just for the Latino community, not just on the West Side, the gentrification issue and affordable housing. There are things that the city hasn't done well. We haven't thought it through. But there is a fairly specific problem or opportunity, but I'm interested in how you look at it and how Guadalupe looks at it: assimilation. Hispanic community can easily assimilate. Some people can easily assimilate. Some people don't want to. Some people do want to, et cetera. And now with this big geographic dispersion that you've got, is that an issue for you? Is it an issue in the community? Is it a good thing, a bad thing? Or is it a personal choice thing?
People want to assimilate. They want to be part of this country. Okay, many times, because our color of our skin, we look different, okay? He said, oh, you're Latino. They think we all speak Spanish, we all like hot sauce. Well, that's not true, We adhere, those traditions such as, the American traditions, Thanksgiving, Christmas, just like everybody else. After, 2-3 generations, they become part of the American fabric. But it doesn't mean you have to lose your culture.
Right.
And that goes back to what Dorothy Gallagher said. She that's one of the reasons they loved her so much, because she told, she saw that it was important, and people had a pride that they wanted to retain that and share it with everybody. It didn't mean that you want to be un-American. That's not the case, and that's not the case with us today.
So preservation of the culture is a part of your mission.
Yeah.
One of the things that in talking to you before about this that impressed me is Guadalupe from the beginning, also about training leaders in many ways, that your educational activities, your social activities, the athletic activities, there's always a core in that of expecting out of that will come leaders in the community. Is that fair?
That's true, and that's one of the reasons we spend so much money towards scholarships for our young people. We believe education is one of the ways that we're going to develop a lot of leadership to go forward. We see it now. We see it especially. We've got some active young people that are involved in politics. Others are involved in government. In the private sector, I think we're doing quite well. A lot of them, I'm very proud of how many are in philanthropy, You'd be surprised. And so we have a pipeline that's developed. We're part of the Hispanic Scholarship Program, and I believe they award annually close to, 300 scholarships to local Latino students to further their education, and we see the results of that endeavor. Those kids are coming back and they're getting on boards and commissions and being engaged.
So I listened to you talk. I look at the pictures, what you've done with the East Side, the Villa, and all the activities you've got going on, and it's pretty extraordinary. 100 years of doing this, and without a lot of help from the major philanthropies and whatnot. I mean, Dorothy Gallagher was fabulous, but one-on-one. And what's the secret of Guadalupe's success?
I think one of the things that I'm proud of, it's intergenerational. One of the things I love that we've got seniors that said, I came here since I was a child. And that makes it different from a lot of the other community centers. We've got families that have been entrenched in the center over decades, over generations. That's huge. But at the same time, we're welcoming the new ones that come in, and they're just astounded to see that all the services that we have that they can benefit from, and that's great. We continue to be the pace setter here locally. We have three not-for-profits. The first one being the parent organization, the Guadalupe Center, Inc. We started the Guadalupe Educational School System, which is our schools, charter schools, and then we started the Guadalupe Center Federal Credit Union. Those three not-for-profits, our combined budget for this year is over $33 million. We serve over 16,000 people in a year's time. And so, we are the 18th largest not-for-profit in the region. That includes St. Joe and Topeka in Kansas City.
Well, I think it's an extraordinary record, which not enough people, not any of us know enough about, and not enough people know anything about. And so I'm really glad that you came here to do this. And if it's okay, I'd love to open this up to questions from the audience.
Sure.
But I do want to thank you, Cris, because it is an amazing story.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here and share our story.
Great. So, questions? Statements?
Yeah, I was
Steve.
just wondering, you talk about assimilation. One of the things that I suppose as you assimilate, you're concerned about the larger culture, the American, how the United States as a culture is doing overall. And so my question is really, how do you think, just forgetting ethnicity for a second, just looking at the country as a whole, how do you think we're doing?
When we have people like our president making statements about, in particular, our particular nationality, Mexicans that were, rapists and prostitutes and drug dealers. I mean, and he's our head of our country. That doesn't bode well. I mean, so we feel like you're not wanted or you're thought of less. We just want the same thing that everybody else wants. We just want to be part of the American, dream. And so we want to be accepted just like you are and have the same opportunities that you do. And so, but when we have people making those kind of statements, it's hard to say, well, we've arrived.
And as a follow-up to that, Cris, there's been some violence in the country very recently, including in Texas, shooting in Texas. Is there worry in our community about that kind of violence?
We have, especially with our immigrant families, Yes, people have really kind of gone underground for they do not come out other than to go to work and to have their kids go to school. And even then, there's a lot of fear. We've had the incident that happened with the Kansas City Police Department where they were assisting the ICE officers. Well, what we had been told prior to that incident was the police department was going to assist. We saw their officers, the Kansas City, Missouri police officers, taking the lead, breaking the window out. That's not assisting. They were taking charge of what happened. We had meetings with the police department to talk to them about that. We didn't feel that was right because the prior two police chiefs had great relationships with them. And they said, we're not going to do ICE's work. That's not our job. If people are doing crimes, arrest them. Put them in jail, do whatever you got to do. But there's a lot of fear right now with just what's going on in the country in terms of, our president and some things that have happened here locally. And so as a result, people are very fearful and they're not coming out and being active as they had been in the past. What's ironic, about 2 weeks later, that had one of the police chiefs or captains call me up and said, hey, we've got a problem here. A lot of the immigrants aren't reporting crimes. I said, well, yeah, they're not going to report crimes. They're scared. They think you're going to arrest them. So, and a lot of times the crimes were against them.
Right. Sorry, over here, question? Bridget?
First, Mr. Medina, thank you very much for your long-term service and leadership of the center. You've been such a gift to the community.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to follow on to that question of, I guess maybe othering, and the idea of the question of public charge and what implications you think that has had for people seeking services that are available.
It's very difficult to help families that do not have status. Because if you're looking, they say that they're utilizing government resources. That's not true. You can't help them if they don't have a social. You've got to have a Social Security number. Only way you can help them if you have private resources to provide them the service. And thank God we do. We'll raise money sometimes from foundations, other times from events that we do to help these families. And then you're limited. The only time you can have kids that are undocumented get benefits is they go to school. Okay? Under the law, they can go to a public school and receive an education up until 12th grade. But other than that, there's no assistance for the public charge. So that misperception that they're draining our resources, that's not true. And even if you look at the statistics, Latinos are less than, I think it's 5% of people that use public assistance. Most of the time, we don't qualify. We're what you call working poor. We're over the government guidelines.
Other question? Yes, sir.
So in Kansas City, are charter schools considered public schools?
Yes, they are. Yes. Yes, public schools, charter schools are public schools. And we receive money from DESE, Department of Elementary and Secondary Education.
There's one other place where you don't need your Social Security number or any other, and that's a kind of identification except an address, and that's the Kansas City Public Library.
Okay. Yeah. And our credit unions. You can do it.
Very good. Very good. Very good.
Chris, what would you say is, in your era, the greatest contribution Guadalupe Center has done?
I think for me, when we bought the center back in 1991, when we moved back to our original building, that was huge because there was when they split from the diocese, there was so much anger and hate in the community. People, a lot of the diehard Catholics are saying, you guys we're going to get excommunicated. You went against the church. Why did you do this? And then you had the militant, the kind of activists said, hey, we're tired of being oppressed. We needed to be able to control our own destiny. For me, the best thing that happened was the separation because it gave us the autonomy to move forward and to grow. I don't think that growth would have happened under the diocese. In fact, we're larger than the diocese now.
So, Chris, Bridget mentioned your longtime service. I forgot to ask you, how long have you done this?
I've been the director since 1980. I was hired in 1978, August of 78, as the youth director under Tony Salazar. And we were housed over at the 2641 Bellevue, which is our youth center. So I served in that capacity until Tony left in March of 1980. Yeah, 1980.
That's pretty phenomenal, isn't it? Pretty phenomenal.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Chris and I go back quite
Yeah.
a ways, actually. You're not 100 years old,
Close. Yeah.
but I'm 80 of those years, and I grew up with the Mexican community you're talking about. I first started out in an orphanage. Pretty much half of them were Hispanics, mainly from Mexico. Then at 4019 Holly, that's where I began to mature as a young teenager. And then I made it through college and went on to Mexico, lived in Mexico for 15 years. So totally familiar with both sides of the problem. Back when Jim Corrin was chief of police, actually it was Major Jim Corrin, one of our biggest problems in the community was the Southwest Boulevard with all the migrants moving in with absolutely nowhere to go, nothing to eat, nowhere to even shave, shower, go to the restrooms. It was pure chaos, and this led to a lot of gang activity. I don't know how they found me or my wife, who happens to be Mexican, but we worked very diligently with the police department of Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas, and we are somewhat ambassadors into Mexico. And the problem that we run into is the culture in Mexico is when there's a problem, everybody just runs away. They don't even trust the police. So you get that same culture, that same mentality migrating to the States. And that was the problem. You have these white officers on the boulevard trying to bring some sense to the unrest that was on the community. It was just extremely difficult. For 10 years, we produced 20 not cadets, they were officers in our language program. And only until the last 5 or so years has it really begun to produce evidence of success of being able to communicate. That resolves the communication problems. They don't run away from us anymore, unless it's a serious problem, and then they will not cooperate with us because they know the end result will be something a little bigger than what they anticipated. Criminals here get prosecuted unless they can find the shield. The word sanctuary becomes an issue, and this is causing a breakdown of the civility of the migrants coming up here again. I think it runs the risk of non-cooperation between the police force, of creating more unrest, and there's going to be more destruction in the area. I don't know what it is on the east side. I haven't spent much time over there, but I see all the Italians have basically moved out, and it's become the new Mexican barrio. But the old West Bottom, where I grew up, or not the bottom, but the west side, they don't identify with the east side. And I know you're playing the same position, you're put in that position, trying to bring this all come together, but if we don't give some respect for the police officers, it's a very dangerous job that they do in Mexico, as well as in Kansas City, Kansas, as well as in Kansas City, Missouri. I think my thrust here is only to let you know that we're sensitive to all this. And the problem that we're running into is, why is it that the Mexicans that want to migrate to the States don't do it legally, as opposed to just come across the border?
Sure. Well, the process is take you years. You might be an old man by the time you get your numbers. It would take years and years, and it's unfortunate. We've got to go back and change our immigration laws. We believe in immigration reform. We need to look at that. Okay, we're not supporting illegal immigration. Okay. So we need to look at how we redo that and reform that and shape that. But we support, immigration reform and legal immigration. In fact, the biggest violators of undocumented in this country are people that come over on student visas and extend their stay. It's not people coming across the wall there, on the southern end of the border. And then they talk about safety. Well, the terrorists came in through Canada when they did 9/11. They didn't come in through Mexico. And so we get scapegoated for all these things, and that's not fair. Yeah.
Well, the overall crime rate for immigrants, if you adjust for age, is actually lower than the population as a whole. So it's gangs in Kansas City are clearly a problem, and that includes people of all races and previous status. But is that a problem for Guadalupe in the schools?
In fact, we started the West Side Can Center. That center was started by the Guadalupe Center. It still exists to this day. That's the only can center that's left in the city. And it's been very successful. If you look at our crime rates, we're one of the lowest. In the urban core, it's one of the lowest. And that's a result of a lot of work from a lot of people. We've got good police officers that have come through our community. Officer Villalobos, Chato Villalobos, he's a product of the center. Officer Arthur Miranda, another product of the center. I mean, they were young kids that came through the center. There's others like them. So we need to have more of them so we can, because they have a beat on the community. They know the neighborhood. They know the families, and that's huge. We don't have that on the east side. And that's one of our challenges as we go over there. When we moved to the east side, that looks like the west side 30 years ago, quite frankly. There's so many challenges over there. It's going to take us a while to get those things addressed. But here, we still have work. Everything's not perfect on the west side. We still have some gangs issues. And what's frustrating, it's kids, Hispanic kids many times from the west side against Kansas kids, east side. It's ridiculous. One thing that's helped us when we did the schools, now we're getting kids from all parts of the city coming to our schools and getting to know each other, getting to work, playing on teams, athletic teams. That's helped to bridge a lot of that, hate and for whatever reason. But we're on top of that.
Quick point, the first lady's parents have been in the country 2 years, they're already citizens.
Good point.
Right.
And I think so many.
Easier for some people than other
So
people.
they have chain migration, and that's, so I guess
Right.
it depends on
Right.
who you know.
Yeah, you're right.
Sorry, is there a question? I'm sorry.
They couldn't hear what he said.
Oh, I was just talking about chain migration in the Trump family. Is there a question somewhere over here before? No. Okay. Well, is there?
You talk about gentrification a lot, and what is the model? What is your vision for developing struggling neighborhoods, communities, without gentrification and pushing people out?
I think a healthy neighborhood has mixed income. Okay, you have people of all different economic levels. I live on the west side, and on my block, I live right there off the exit of 20th Street. I got 3 houses that live up the street from me that are these $1 million homes. Okay, my house is not a $1 million home. What's happened, well, these tax assessments are a result of all those new housing, okay? And my property value went up 300% plus. For a lot of our other seniors, that's also an issue, and for a lot of people, a lot of low-income families, they can't afford that, okay? We also still have some government subsidy housing on the west side, okay? So we need to have some kind of a master plan where we can have all these different types of housing and address all these different issues. I'm tired of seeing these houses, these new houses being built. What they do, they buy properties one at a time, and they sit on them, and they let them decay until they can buy the next one, and then they'll tear that down, and then they come and build these huge homes, which make no sense. I mean, we're having another issue on the west side with these Airbnbs. I mean, That's a major problem. And so, you know,
Yeah, the first thing is we've got to identify that there is a problem, what's causing it, and I think we're getting there. That's finally gentrification's become an issue, and it's not, gentrification's not all bad. I mean, you know, we're cleaning up some neighborhoods, we're moving some single family building into some neighborhoods, infill, et cetera. But if you're on a fixed income, and you know, if you're on the west side, you've got a lot of people, older people who are on a fixed income. They're, you know, what are you going to do? Or you're forced out if your assessment goes up 300 or 400%, and their taxes, your property taxes go up 300 or 400%. So we have to address that, and there are ways to address it by adjusting tax policy and so on. And we're just at the beginning of that. The city hasn't thought very much about it. We did some gentrification, deliberate gentrification in certain neighborhoods. If you look at the Beacon Hill neighborhood as an example, the west side is not mostly deliberate. You know, it happened for a variety of reasons, but there are some places where it was deliberate and the city just didn't think about it until now. And I think we're beginning to think about it, and conversations like this will help.
Out of curiosity, Chris, your neighbors that have the $1 million home, are they Hispanic?
no, none of them are. Unfortunately, no.
Well, if there are no more questions, I'd like to say thank you to Cris Medina and the Guadalupe Center for what you've done and for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kemper. Appreciate it. Thank you.